It's a little shadowy, but he said he expected that in the shadow of the lunar module. Armstrong is on the moon. Neil Armstrong, 38-year-old American, standing on the surface of the moon on this July 20th, 1969.
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
I think that was Neil's quote. I didn't understand it.
No, one small step for man, but I didn't get the second phrase.
For fuck's sake.
For fuck's sake.
I can't believe the CBS guys almost stepped on Neil's quote there. The infamous and probably still somewhat debated, although Neil is no longer around. Did he say a man, mankind? So isn't man and mankind the same thing and all that stuff? But yeah, CBS reporters almost on their broadcast anyway. Obviously, the original source material was not in danger of being stepped on, which is interesting and which is part of the topic for today's episode of FFS Talk, the podcast about what works, what doesn't, and what we do about it. Flying solo once again. The topic of news, or really news reporting. News is probably just the reporting of news. Journalism is the capturing of what will go into news, perhaps. Anyway, so the selection of the famous Neil Armstrong quote on jumping off the ladder from the LEM, the Lunar Excursion Module, onto the moon's surface. One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. That is the story. The fact, well, there are many, still disputed today as well. A spacecraft flew to the moon through space, orbited the moon, left Michael Collins in the command module. Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin go down to the surface in a lander. Neil Armstrong is the first man to step foot on the moon, as far as we know. There's probably, well, it probably wouldn't fit on an 8-inch floppy, but there's no doubt tons of telemetry. Some of it probably still exists today. It wasn't thrown out on old tapes or whatever, printouts, however they were storing it. But there are facts, there's telemetry, there are numbers, there are radar tracks. I mean, I think there have been ironically news articles about how NASA did not necessarily take the best care of their data archives. But the story is the quote and the landing video. They had video of Neil, Mr. Armstrong, stepping off the lander onto the moon's surface. That's the story. And news is told in story form. And that is perhaps what doesn't work. Why? So, if something happens today, it's still told in story form. You can, well, we've all heard some version of what happened on January 6th in Washington, D.C. in America. We've all heard about various bits of various allegations of voter fraud. We've all heard about various celebrity crimes, the white Bronco. If you don't know what I'm talking about, then you're probably lucky. But the stories of what happened, the accounts told in newspapers through quotes, through analysis, which is a common term now used to justify the hours and hours of discussion, punditry, arguing with agenda, almost certainly, the filling in of an empty chair with a known talking head who will, shake their head in the appropriate direction to fill out a panel to get a point across. Excuse me. I'll drink of water. So, but we have these devices. We have mobile devices in our pockets. We have desktop, laptop. We have cloud computing infrastructure. We have smart TVs. We have podcasting like this. We have live streams. We have so many paths, not to mention the written word. And now there are so many ways to display that written word. So I could read an article sent to me as plain old text. I could read the article of the actual landing report from July 1969, all about Neil Armstrong landing. It would probably be similar to reading a teletype news report, The Wire. This just in. So I could just read the plain old text, and I would be left to my own devices as far as tracking down named people, programs, budgets, anything I was curious about knowing more about. You're on your own. Go. And back then, you couldn't Google or Bing or whatever your favorite search engine is. You couldn't even Alta Vista. You couldn't Yahoo. So you started off with this plain old text, and it was a story told. If it was the brief, sort of terse fact story, right? It's just actually I should have dug up the actual. I'm sure there was a wire sent out when Neil Armstrong actually stepped off the LEM, but it's as simple as Neil Armstrong has landed on the moon, or lunar module lands safely in Sea of Tranquility, or these very simple, terse. But what does safely mean? What does stepping off the LEM constitute being the first human on the moon? Wouldn't Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong both have been the first humans on the moon, technically? Because, if you want to get philosophical, they're both in a neither would be able to survive on the moon's surface without their protective gear. The protective gear includes the aluminum foil, which was the lunar excursion module, and their spacesuits. So really, when you think about it, if you care to, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin were both on the moon at the same time. Either way, the fact is, two human beings landed on the moon after traveling. We could have numbers, radar tracks, orbital trajectories, orbital transfer from Earth to moon orbit, all that stuff, right? So there are scientific facts, and there are measurable, objective data that would draw a picture of what happened. But the news is the story. So whatever I've read, I'm going to form an opinion on. If I look at the path that the command module took once it left Earth's orbit, that's interesting. If I look at the numbers for it, that's a little bit more obscure, unless you are familiar with reading that type of data and visualizing it for yourself. So the news really took place, even though it almost got stepped on, when the famous quote was uttered and broadcast to the world in delayed real time. That was the news, no matter what else happened. So, the news is the story is the news. The question, though, is, given all the technology we have at our disposal, should we, humanity, consumers of news, should we be relying so heavily on the techniques and the style, the tricks that have been in use since, probably since since the first time somebody drew on the inside of a cave wall, right? Like maybe we went out hunting and there was one buffalo, but we're going to draw 5. Seems more impressive. So the story is, look at that. We had 5 buffalo. We were hunting and they got the drop on us. And we got 1. But maybe it was just 1 buffalo sitting there chewing on the cud. And they went up and did their thing and brought a bunch of buffalo meat home to the village, whatever the organizational unit was. So the story may not be backed up by the facts. Maybe there's tracks. I doubt it, but maybe there were tracks from the buffalo, and you could actually sort of decode the interactions out on the plain, and you could see the prints, the hoof prints, and the footprints, and spearheads, and all that stuff. And you'd say, hey, there was only one buffalo here. So, but the story gets the attention. So all that back page, all that B-roll, all that whatever. They got us a buffalo. If they saw 5 or 2, so the credibility of the story is sort of a matter of emotional preference, right? Maybe I prefer to hear the story. Maybe I prefer to hear the exciting version of the story. Maybe when I retell it, the famous telephone game, it will become 10 or 20 buffalo or whatever, right? These are the simplest of tales imprinted on cave walls. And so today we have the headline. The headline is almost never written by the author of an article. It's written based on where it will be placed in the print media or on the website. Now, on websites, that may not be the case, especially if you're an independent reporter, publisher. But classically, the headline was written to get attention. It was sensational. And so the sensational headline would get clicked upon. Back in the day, that meant paying for the newspaper and reading it. And often the article would run off the page and, continued on page 6 or page 4 or whatever. And that would continue pulling people into the paper, reading other things and whatnot. And the reverse pyramid, who, what, when, where, why, how. The wow part is sometimes added, but that's the sensational headline. That's the inviting photograph, if they're, when photos could get printed in halftone and whatnot. And the idea was to draw people into this article with the facts up front and then fill in some story, fill in the backstory, catch them up if this is an ongoing tale, or maybe you just fill in like, Neil Armstrong lands on the moon, date, time, Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin. Maybe on the second page, after it's continued into somewhere else in the paper, they mention the command module, and astronaut Michael Collins was up there waiting, managing the command module, ready to pick them up when they're ready to go home, like a parent going to the mall, right? But the news is reported so that those who are curious can stick with it and get Neil Armstrong was a test pilot for the U.S. Air Force, or what? I didn't look that up, but most of the initial astronauts were test pilots or were knew their way around a jet. And he went to so and so college, and he was in this and did that, and he lives in so there's some backstory, and these are the less important personal details or trivia or connecting information. How did the astronauts know each other? All these things. These are interesting supporting details. And then what happens as a story progresses into the second, third, fifth, 10th day, month, year. Whenever there's a story, the people writing a story will need to select how much backstory to include so that the reader may not have been keeping up with the entire series of articles, so you got to fill them in a little bit. Okay, that was print media. Then the news came along, news on television, I should say, broadcast news, or radio, and they can tell you what's happening. Sometimes they're just reading a newspaper. They tell you, but if they report it through the day, it gets kind of boring, so they got to keep it interesting. They want to make sure they get your attention. So they have a catchy headline or announcement, the A block, all that. So the point I'm making here is that you bring all this forward to the web or to the modern media, and news is reported in much the same way. I am given an article on choose your favorite media outlet, and it's got a clickbaity headline and some sort of a attention-grabbing photo. People want that to be shared on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, TikTok. So you have to make this content so it catches the eye and it's appealing and shareable, because you want people to click on it, and then they arrive at your article and they read the first paragraph, or sometimes there's a TLDR, too long didn't read, rundown, bulleted. I think the Daily Mail does that. The salient facts are bulleted right up front, and then you can read the article. So these are all ways of reporting news, but they're in story form. And the reason you tell people the story is that is how they remember it. And if you read about history and how history was passed on from generation to generation or across regions, how do you grow this vegetable? How do you farm? How do you feed your animals? How do you, do whatever? How does your village survive successfully? Can you help us do the same while you tell them the story? You may not necessarily be able to share specific crop data, micronutrient content in your soil. You're not doing numerical analysis on animal husbandry success, genetic backgrounds. You're not delving into the science. You're sharing a story. Well, when the sun comes up and it's cold and you do this, and you're telling, here's my experience, and you're imparting that as a story. And same with history. You're passing that around and down generations. Stories are exciting. They evoke an emotional response. We remember them. And news feeds that need. And so that is how news is reported, in story form, because humans know stories. We love hearing stories. There's a whole movie industry that was on the brink of disaster, but now movie theaters are open again. Ooh, we can go see movies again. And the media industry, on the other hand, the news media industry, is clamoring because we have a boring president in the United States now, and we have people can go outside, so they're not sitting at home hearing daily reporting from one side or the other of a political boxing match. You can get back to life, right? So the stories are what keep people attending to the news, even though it may not interest them, maybe it doesn't directly affect them, but getting riled up. There's the dopamine hits, and there's the adrenaline rush of hearing something you don't like, and the anger brewing, and that's what draws people in. So is this the only thing we have available to us with all the technology we have at our disposal? So do you, listening to this right now, find that telling a story or listening to a story are the pinnacle of informing the public? You, people around you, friends, family, community, city, world. So, what I have myself been pondering, excuse me, was 2 weeks ago, we had delivering Big Delta episode of the FFS Talk podcast, talking about the notion of changing the world and what that entails, and imagined realities and and objective realities. And in the show notes, one of the YouTube videos I included was a presentation about microservices. You might think, what does that have to do with anything? So, bringing that forward again today, so I'll include that presentation, and there are many. You can once you begin down the path of microservice presentations on YouTube, you will be presented with many hours worth of different viewpoints and case studies, and you'll end up watching a lot of Netflix YouTube presentations about delivering Netflix videos. Presentations are on YouTube, strangely, but anyway. So the microservice notion has had me pondering, and this is where it would be interesting to talk to people working on publication platforms, especially around news. And I will now make that connection to microservices. So microservices are factoring what they call the monolith, your single giant application, into little services, microservices. So if you can imagine, if you've ever been entrepreneurial and you've worked by yourself, you know that you wear all of the hats, and you must got to do everything. And when you are stuck doing one thing, you can't do the other thing, and so on. So you have to keep all the numbers in your head, or on a piece of paper, or a Evernote, or pick your Slack or whatever. But if you're working by yourself, you're tracking all this data, you're making decisions, you're taking actions, and you are subject to forgetting, making an error, getting bogged down, stuck doing something. So the monolith doesn't scale well. As you get more busy, you're like, I can't do all this by myself. So you hire another person, and so on, right? You grow your company, you accomplish more, you're more profitable, all those nice things. So you have to start factoring the workload so that other people can do parts of it and interact, right? So you maybe you have your accounting department, and maybe your department is one person, but they are doing accounting, so that takes it off of your plate. Okay, so the general idea of microservices, the analogy to a workplace, I believe that's Conway's law, that suggests that a computer system will mirror its environment. So maybe you deploy microservices that align with your employees if you want to go that way, but that's not the point right now. So once you have broken up your services on the computer side, or your tasks, I suppose, then the question is, well, how do I tell the accounting department that we need to pay somebody? And so the warehouse, customer order, payment, invoice, fulfillment, all those workflows or all those components and the workflow that connects them are a common example for microservice architecture example, or demonstration, I suppose, because very practical, and there are very tangible situations that arise if your invoice works and your warehouse fulfillment, shipping workflow fails. The person paid for it, they didn't get what they ordered. Here comes tech support, or a customer support call, and they got to contact tech support and say what happened to the order. And so it becomes kind of a hassle, right? But the nice part is that on the computer side of that interchange, unless somebody really made a big mistake, there's going to be some sort of a log or some sort of indication of what happened and where and why something failed, or you'll see the invoice and you'll see no corresponding order. So you can actually reconstruct. Maybe it's a forensic endeavor and you have to do some digging, or maybe it's as simple as, oh, we had an event queue. The queue got full from a system failure and incoming orders, and we had a backlog, and the backlog is sitting on a disk somewhere, and it didn't get pull it back into the queue. So somebody hits a button, types in the right command, and there you go. So the interchange of people when it comes to day-to-day tasks and work and commerce, these are relatively straightforward. If you look at very exciting human interest things, the weather, trust me, it's exciting. I'm in Las Vegas right now. It's still hot. And it's long into the evening on Sunday. Today's June 6th, by the way, 2021. So the weather, you can look back in time until since they first started recording. The data gets probably a little bit more accurate and a little bit more granular over time. Weather satellites and just the Internet of Things, data sensors, all these advancements over the years, you get more data. So weather, sports data, you want to know what the team, what the stats are for a particular player, what the team did over some away game versus home game, seasonal, player injuries, all that, statistics aplenty. Traffic data sometimes has traffic cameras and detail. So we have established a real world of high availability data where we can get the weather. You can get your sports score. If you can't get your sports score, there's riot potential, right? So people are pretty serious about that. So weather, sports, obviously stock pricing, stock reporting is big business. It is critical that people get their stock reports, and clearly, if you are reading stocks in the newspaper, you are not keeping up with stock trading. But high frequency traders are getting real time data, and they're paying for it. But you're getting actual data, right? You're not listening to Jim Cramer tell the story about stocks. That's analysis. That's later. That's an emotional response. But the actual numbers are changing perhaps based on that emotional response. But the actual numbers are where you make the money, not specifically on the story. The sports scores, if you've wagered or if you just have an emotional investment, you are getting your fix based on the data, not on the story. The color person on the audio telling the backstory about the pitcher or the game from last time and what happened with so and so, or they're adding color to the story. They're making it more interesting because between plays, during a timeout, during a penalty phase, whatever, people are waiting. They're waiting for something to happen, and you fill in those downtimes with story. So the story about the game and about the excitement of the transition between 0-0 to 0-1 to 1 to 2 to and so on, all those are the data, but you got to keep it interesting with the story, the reporting. So weather news, sports news, financial news, these are reported with a factual basis and a emotional tale, and often somewhat probably useful, but maybe not completely essential analysis. And that is where you fill up your 24-hour cable news schedule. Maybe you have an ESPN style station. You're doing nothing but sports. How do you fill up 24 hours of sports with sports reporting? How do you fill up a business news network with 24 hours reporting if stock markets are only open for certain hours and so on? And here's the data. You can get the data, but people want the story. So what am I getting at here? The reporting of the emotional component of news is what people are presented with. It's what they click on. It's what they monetize. It's what they slap a bunch of ads on. I don't know if you've ever scrolled towards the bottom of your local news outlet, but it seems rampant. You're going to get the story of a Elizabeth Hurley's 55-year-old Elizabeth Hurley first bikini shoot. I saw that one today. Right, that's on the news website. It might have been CNN. It might have been my local news. Doesn't matter. There's they got to pay their bills, so clearly the news about car accidents and shootings and record temperatures and declining vaccination rates and the list goes on. Those are not quite interesting enough. So tell me about Elizabeth Hurley. So news, and I'm not the first one to say this, news has some trouble paying for itself. If you look at something like the Consilience Project, I'll put a link to that in the notes. That's another attempt at building good stories, because what you'll get in a story is the emotional response to news by the person reporting it, either by the writer of the news or the staff that puts together a report, the production of the news broadcast, the person speaking the news, their agenda, if any. So the gap between authority, the source of truth, the actual events that transpired, and the telling of the story, it's what humans find most appealing, but it's where errors arise and continue to grow. So, what do we do about this? If we presume that the news infrastructure is essential, and it is, and we assume for a moment that it's fixable, or that I should say that it's problematic and fixable, what we have at our disposal is an infrastructure of communication that is unrivaled in history. I've seen some commentary lately that certainly the history of the world advanced regardless of whether there was a Gutenberg printing press or a telegraph or Twitter. But these have accelerated the communication of ideas. Maybe that statement alone is worth picking apart. It's communication of ideas which are made accessible to people who can not necessarily act on ideas, but who can support action on ideas. So if you had to print a book or create a newsreel that talked about alleged election fraud, it would take a while. You could still do it. But now the power of tweets and Facebook and other social media places the news makers, those alleging fraud, the candidates involved in the election, the voters themselves, the people that run the voting, so the election officials in different localities, it puts them all kind of on a level playing field where they can tweet at each other, they can make various assertions without factual background information or any sort of references or legitimate reporting. You know, the notion of journalism out the window. And what you end up with then is a cacophony of data flying around. That's literally data. It's a very low information, high noise ratio, right? Low signal to noise ratio. So the connectivity we now possess, coupled with the desire to feed our emotion, right? I want to get tweets from people I agree with, and I'm not saying anything new here. And I want to, we used to call it flaming people. You'd have flame wars. Now they call it, I don't even know what they call it anymore, but they kind of gang up on someone, or they'll retweet something misrepresenting it. They'll attach some sort of a commentary that uses a headline which is itself sensational to make a point that is not borne out in the text of an article, which was probably written by someone else who did the research, but the headline is salacious. So you're going to get someone that, I'm going to use that headline to make my point. And if the headline is talking about a well-known person or event, then you'll get attention. Maybe you'll get trending. And so all these things feed back on each other. So going back to the microservice architectures of the day, so it's 2021 now. We'll see how much they change by the end of this year. But there's a notion now of messaging, message queues, these microservices. So what does that mean? It means that you're not telling a story to your microservices because you want to make sure that things actually align with the truth, as in there was an order placed and a payment made and an item shipped. Those should all have an associated time and other metadata, like, where was the IP address of the client that was used to place the order, and the bank routing numbers and other transaction data for the payment, and so on, and so the SKU and the price of that day and the shipping. All of these items, all these components that make up what will eventually be a purchase and fulfillment in this example, they all have different events associated with them. So it's not really a story, it's specific events that have taken place at particular times and maybe places or virtual places. And they're all storable. They can be analyzed. You can still tell the story. You can still say, I ordered a package and I didn't get it. And then I had to order it again. Or I had to call support and then they said, we didn't ship it. We forgot. So you'll get a story from the facts. But when you attempt to base decisions on the story, you ultimately get a version of the facts as someone or someones might recognize or assume them to be, when that might not be the case at all. So what if news were reported based on a source of truth, a truth repository, a fact database, where any casual person could go not only hear what, who's a good one? I guess the two most popular cable news, who has cable anymore? The two most popular cable news hosts today, as of June 6, 2021, are Rachel Maddow on MSNBC and Tucker Carlson on Fox. So we can assume that's true. May or may not be completely accurate, but suppose it is. So you may hear what they have to say, and often it is taken as truth, right? The authority is presumed. We have assigned a certain level of trust to the person on the TV telling us a story, and we assume it's true. But there's never a bibliography. There's never a reference list. There's never endorsement by others. If quotes are given, we assume the publication has the credibility to not publish an unacknowledged quote, for example. You can quote anonymous sources. That happens all the time. But if somebody writes, according to Dan Hugo, who said, pineapple goes great on pizza, and then I might never even know that they quoted me. Misquoted me, in fact. So the onus is placed on the quoted, never knowing that they were quoted, right? So the infrastructure exists now, though, to actually notify the quoted person, to provide some sort of a reference quotation. If some other news outlet, print media, blogger, YouTuber, if they want to reuse that reporting, then now you have a once or twice removed reference with no backup, no authoritative reference to verify against. So now this misquotation about Dan Hugo liking pineapple on pizza can start to spread, and how do you even fix that? So you're tracking down these stories that are based on a single fact that is incorrect. So you don't have 3 incorrect facts to fix. You have 1 incorrect fact, but 3 stories, or actually 1 story and then 2 stories from that 1 story. So the telling of stories, the telephone game, for those familiar with that old reference, my favorite telling of that, the description of that, is Bob Newhart from many years ago. He says, you know how you start with a story and it gets better and better until at the end it's completely unbelievable and has nothing to do with the actual story. So it's very easy to, with an agenda or with a profit motive or something else, some other reasoning, whatever it is, you take fragments of a story, you take excerpts, you take quotations, you take photos, and you can construct a different narrative, a different story, using some of the facts that were collected to form the first story. So what I'm getting at here is the capturing of the facts themselves, the photo, where was it taken, what time, so the EXIF data of your of each photo that you take. Your camera attaches all this data. If it has GPS, it'll tell you where it was taken, it'll tell you when it was taken, it'll tell you camera settings. You could probably estimate from the EXIF data, you could estimate how far away the subject of the image was, right? What the focal settings were at that time. So if the person's in focus, they were approximately this far away. So you can kind of construct some things, some of the sort of derivative facts, right? Estimated facts, right? Distance to subject derived from EXIF data. But you can get a quote, you can get a sensor reading, right? If you were driving in your car and say you're in your Tesla, you're the highest tech electronic car you can pick up at any given time. Maybe it's a Tesla or whatever it is, but so you got your Tesla, you're driving along, and instead of a speedometer and instead of a map on the screen to distract you, you just have some voice-based assistant driving a Rio, the back seat of your car, your radar intercept officer, saying things like "turn left here," which that's old school GPS. I'm sure you've all heard jokes about that or whatnot, and people end up driving into a lake or into a building or into a farmer's market. All these unfortunate tales. But if your car was also telling you your speed limit, telling you your current speed, maybe against the speed limit, right? So you are traveling at 47 miles per hour in a 35. If it was reading these numbers to you, but maybe the story is delayed, maybe the car is telling you something from before you were at the stoplight, right? So you're going 45 and you're like, I'm sitting at a red light. I'm not going that fast anymore. So the story is delayed. So do you still trust that story? So now it's a question of trusting the version of the facts as you know them, but maybe you don't have the right facts because maybe you're listening to some other, maybe you have your phone is telling you how fast it thinks you're going. So there's only more and more data, right? We talked about weather data. There's plenty of weather data. And one of my favorite weather websites for the longest time was Weather Underground, and not to be confused with the Radical Group from the 60s. This was a website. They had the Wonder Map, as in Weather Underground, Wonderground, Wonder Map. And they would map personal weather station data that you could submit to them, and it would place it on a map, and you could visually see when maybe somebody's sensor was wrong, right? Like, hey, all the sensors are within 2 degrees of each other with a wind blowing according to if they had a wind sensor. And then this one weather station is reporting, 20 degrees hot. That's clearly wrong, right? So you can compare sensor data. You can do it visually. You can do it mathematically and statistically. But that's data being turned into information. But if you only have data on more data, none of it being checked, correlated, analyzed, and you rely on the storytelling to cherry pick the data that seems to fit a narrative and to tell it to you, and there's no really useful way to go back from story to data to determine how the information that is the story, it's the information plus emotion equals news story, I guess. So without the facilities for that, you end up with the elephant problem, right? Which you've heard the blind people. Is it four blind men and trying to figure out what an elephant is, and they grab a trunk or a tail or a leg, and they each come up with something else because there's no coherent way for everybody to collect the same data or to make the same assumptions when they're telling their story about the information that they derive from this data that's flying at us. So the microservice idea moved into news reporting is to have facts, have data, a fact being a quote, data being some hard number, some verifiable, number of missiles, number of cars, number of people injured, the velocity of a car passing through an intersection before it struck another car. Right? These are pieces of data that can be either directly or indirectly measured. If there's a traffic camera, you can measure the rate of speed, the velocity of a vehicle. If you make the video and the analysis transparent, then the data is available. And if these messages that contain these facts that are flying at these microservices that are basically the consumers of these facts, the news, people consuming news, then you can go back and examine the facts as they were sent in these messages and have some notion of the reliability of the news you're consuming. Had to get a drink there. It'd be so nice if there was another person speaking so I could take a drink break now and then and not speak by myself. But that's another story. So that's an actual story. That's a fact. It's not a story. It's a fact. So the notion that I've been pondering myself is I actually submitted a Y Combinator proposal. I think it was it 3 summers ago? It was the summer cohort, and fake news was all the rage. So they wanted to have a notion of how to address fake news, right? Startups that they would invite to participate for the summer cohort. What's your approach on fake news? And I think it was one of 3 tracts they had, but they were all sort of along those lines. So my idea was involving the capturing of actual facts and making those facts available. I mean, technically you should be able to hyperlink. That's what they're there for. You should be able to hyperlink in these references. Maybe it's at the bottom of a page. If it's a print article, maybe it's show notes, which are made available to you for this episode of the podcast, just like any other. Show notes are a great way to provide the links that were talked about, the name of the person you were interviewing, and so the quote, whatever you want to fill that in with something that someone can go back to later and follow up on. Right? I've already mentioned I'm going to pull one YouTube link from 2 weeks ago from the Delivering Big Delta episode, and I will place it in the show notes for this episode. If someone is independent media is kind of exploding here in it was in 2020 really, and 2021 now. So there's a move towards Substack as one popular method. There's Review, Hugo Floss, my other podcast, Quaggling Sand, and this FFS Talk podcast all make use of those 2 newsletter schemes for show notes and other articles. So I will tell you that they are interesting but not sufficient, in my opinion. But as the return to this sort of a text-based media sharing, so that it's arriving in my inbox and it's Maybe I'm even paying for it. Maybe I'm subscribed. I'm a paying supporter to subscriber to support the reporting done by, fill in the blank. Then how do I know, other than my own trust in the person I'm paying my money to, how do I know that what they said was correct? Or they may have the best intentions and they may correct something, but where does that correction show up? And the onus is really on the person reading, consuming the news, to include that correction, the update, in their mental picture, their mental, the mental story that they themselves are putting together as they hear different facets and they read different stories. They have to make sure that they update their current perception of what's happening if there's a correction. And that doesn't always happen. So if articles, if news reporting, if podcasts, if blog posts, if newsletters, if there was a way to point to sources of truth in a machine-friendly way, schema.org. So if you can annotate your references in a usable way, then whenever a collection of references forms the basis of news reporting, you can read the story because you're still a human. But at some point, if one of those the referenced facts, if something changes, if a quote ends up being corrected, if a numerical value, here's a weird example perhaps, but June, I think it was like June 19th or something. It's coming up. 1990, I was working in a computer. I was a programmer, my first programmer job, getting money to code. It was probably slightly more money than I can't remember. I think it might have been $5 an hour or something crazy. Ridiculous, right? But it was 1990. And I was sitting in an office with Basic 4 mainframe and EverX 286 computers. And so they had to keep it cool, probably 70 degrees Fahrenheit. And on the day in question, which I have not verified, but I think it's coming up, the anniversary. The news was reporting the temperature at the airport at 122 degrees Fahrenheit. Aircraft takeoffs were canceled. Planes were grounded because the air density is outside of the measured range that the FCC. If the FAA, I think it was just a question of not having data, right? They just didn't know. Nobody measured airfoil performance for commercial jets beyond 120 degrees, I think it was. So 122 degrees Fahrenheit, I drove a Volkswagen Bug without air conditioning, so I remember that day pretty well. It was seared into my everywhere. So in reporting that news, it would be completely reasonable to check that record. So if I went back in time, I found some news archives, I might find the Arizona Republic is the newspaper of record for Arizona, Phoenix area. I will almost certainly find at least one news article about the record-breaking temperatures. And they'll quote that value. And I want to say it's 122 degrees measured at the airport. Now, 2 years later, say, I'm just purely hypothetical at this point. Maybe 2 years later, somebody said, "Oh, the weather, the weather package at the airport it was out of adjustment. It was needed to be calibrated." So on calibration, they determined that it was actually probably 124 degrees. Right? I'm just making this up. So weather data can be annotated, be back annotated. So it could be the corrected value for that day. Probably, I don't know how they annotate weather data, but maybe an asterisk or maybe some other comment or annotation in general that says the weather data had to be adjusted from the original reported values for whatever. So there's a process in place for correcting this data. But will the Arizona Republic now correct their newspaper articles? No. So the basis, and if it had gone the other way, maybe the temperature was actually off in the wrong direction. Maybe it was actually 119 degrees, and the aircraft were mistakenly grounded, and they shouldn't have been. And all of the cascading delays, that would be news on that day, the day that was discovered, right? So 2 years after the fact, they might say, oh, back in the day when there was this reporting, but it was wrong. So events, the data on which event reporting is based can be corrected, but the reporting itself, the stories, typically will not be. Probably because of, it's not worth it. So they publish corrections rather than correcting the stories. So after the fact, you may see there was a correction in the reporting from June of 1990. Without annotating the actual article, then you are placing the onus on the consumer of the news again to track down what actually happened. So how often do you do that? So another example, which sticking with aviation, there was a time, and I do not remember when, there was a flight with a DC-10, I believe it was. And I believe it was the left or port engine, number one engine, fell off. So news reporting on the actual, the engine falls off. The plane becomes, I think in that case it was just a complete failure. I think it crashed. But that's not the interesting part. I don't like plane crashes. Nobody does. So, that's not the point, though. So the reporting is on the engine fell off. The NTSB would do their analysis. They would figure out what happened. They reassemble the plane based from the parts, and they interview people. And there's maybe the news will report on a maintenance issue. It was a maintenance issue, and it was failure in the retaining bolts on the nacelle under the wing, and so on. So there will be a consumer-friendly version of the tale, and it will be told, and that's unfortunate, and then we move on. So if you dig a little bit deeper, you find out that the maintenance manual for the underwing engines 1 and 3 on a DC-10. I think it's a DC-10. It might have. Yeah, I think the L-1011 had a turbine blade in the number 2 engine. I think failed. That was the big L-1011 thing. But DC-10 engine fell off. It was a source of political cartoon. I don't know, not humor, but those DC-10s, the engines are always falling off, that kind of thing. So in the documentation for the maintenance on those engines, there was a procedure to adjust things, right? To perform maintenance tasks on the nacelle, on the mount, or nacelle if you're playing Scotty on Star Trek. So the prescribed procedure included supporting the weight of the engine with a forklift while it was partially connected to the wing. And as it turns out, the maintenance procedure began. The forklift was placed under the engine. It was supporting the engine, all according to the manual. And then it was the end of the shift. So the forklift remained holding the engine in place. The shift ended. Maintenance crew went off shift. The next shift of people came on. It wasn't instantaneous handoff, so there was a delay. And when the maintenance crew on the next shift, whenever that was, however much time had passed, they're just going to pick up right where the maintenance procedure checklist is, right? So they go, okay, they've finished steps 1 through 80. We're on to step 81. And they pick it up and they go. What was not included in the manual, what was not included for consideration, this is one of those hard lessons, was that the hydraulic system in the forklift had actually not failed, but it did not hold the precise position of the forks holding the engine up. So the hydraulics, I guess, leaked enough. There was enough bleed to allow the forks to drop down just enough. We're not talking inches. We're probably talking half an inch or something, some small distance, whatever it was. And this put extra stress, some extra torque on the mount that was as it was still attached, or whatever the internal failure was in the nacelle. So that, but it was undetected initially. So maybe it caused some fractures in the metal, something, extra torque on the retaining bolts, whatever the failure was. That'll be a project for later. We'll figure out what that was. They reassembled the engine, sent it on its way. But the critical thing here was that they documented all of these things, right? When the shift went off, here was the step where we were in the maintenance process. The facts were auditable. They could be replayed. They could figure out what happened. And they determined it was the forklift part of the procedure could lead to this type of failure, which could lead to an engine falling off the wing, because whatever the damage was done eventually led to a catastrophic failure of the mount, and an engine fell off. So when you can rebuild events or rebuild a scenario from events that you are able to find, you can form an opinion, you can make a decision, you can treat the news that you're consuming as useful and not merely emotional. And if you go back to, like I said, the weather, sports, financial data, these mostly have a reconstructible, auditable stack of data. And you can see there's reporting on status, there's reporting on change, right? You're not going to get reporting every day of the same number. It'll just be one number and it didn't change. So maybe it's a question of capturing state transition in your event queue, or maybe it's actual repeating status. Whatever the case is, having that data enables legitimate decision making and correction after the fact, and learning, and future decision making, and different policies and procedures and best practices can be made when you rely not merely on emotion but on this auditable fact chain, right? So the notion moving forward would be to keep the news story format, because that is how people consume news, but at least expose the underlying basis of the story, the facts that make up the story, that you can actually go and reconstruct some version of, radar tracks and sensor values and quotations and video clips and, specific data. And when any of those facts are called into question or shown to be, maliciously or erroneously in error, erroneously in error sounds weird, but what I mean is if it was a bad sensor reading or a sensor reading that was falsified, right? So maliciously or erroneously incorrect, those things can feed back into the stories. So modern news can be made better, or at least more trustworthy, if actual, not alternative, but actual auditable, transparent facts can be attached and made visible to the consumers of news, so that this modern world can be better understood and better decisions can be made. That's the premise. So can we take the working notion of news and the working communication infrastructure, try to filter out some of the emotional sensationalism and outright falsification with agenda, profit motive, political power, whatever it is? Can we arrive at a system that is trustworthy based on transparent, factual reference? That's the question. What do we do about it? Well, I guess we try it. And that's where I will leave this topic for today. Although I would very much like to talk to anyone who is doing modern journalism techniques, best practices, to sort of along the lines of that cohort I mentioned for Y Combinator. So what is the state of the art in tracking facts and attaching stories to facts and vice versa for that transparency? I mentioned the Consilience Project, which I will include. It's an interesting idea. It's basically writing stories using AI, which is fine. Stories are how people consume news. That's not a problem. The problem enters the picture when the stories are based on something other than facts. And so it's attachment of facts to stories. It's adapting the news reporting infrastructure to include an auditable, transparent component that I could go, rather than scraping news articles and trying to figure out, John Smith and his cousin John Smith did something. Well, now grammatically that's a challenge. So how am I going to recognize which of the actors in this story are, which one's which? John Smith killed John Smith. That's going to be that's a tricky one. That's killing people is not as funny. But so how do we identify the actors, the actions, the transitions, the deltas, the changes? How do we take a system of authority when it comes to facts and enable the creation and telling of good, usable, honest stories with whatever agenda, whatever emotional response, whatever the actual nature of the story is? But how can we enable that backed up with facts that anyone could go and examine for themselves and form their own opinion? You may enjoy hearing Tucker Carlson's take on vaccination, or Rachel Maddow's take on everything Russia. You may enjoy those things. You may find them entertaining. You may find them invigorating. They may be the basis for your discussion at work tomorrow or at the pub tomorrow night or tonight. But the ability to find and audit and reconstruct facts for yourself in a transparent way is arguably a worthwhile consideration moving forward. So thank you for listening to another episode of the FFS Talk podcast, where we tackle what works and what doesn't, and what we can do about it for various topic arcs. The show notes for this episode, as it has been true recently, will be published as a Substack newsletter for Monday, June 7th. So if you check out ffstalk.substack.com, or a link in the, if you're listening to this via an RSS feed, in the podcast description, you will find a link to the show notes newsletter. I'm going to check that right now, make sure I'm not forgetting. Yes, ffstalk.substack.com. And in that show notes newsletter, you will also get a link to the weekend edition. That's where we follow up on anything interesting, and if there are any guests upcoming or anything interesting will appear in the Weekender newsletter. But the show notes are published as an email that you can get in your inbox via Substack. And as I said earlier in the show today, in the episode, they are useful, but not completely sufficient. So if and when we make a change to local hosted publication of the show notes, you will certainly hear about it. But for the moment, ffstalk.substack.com. Check it out. Starting to post links to that on Twitter and the usual places, but there it is. Check the show notes. Subscribe to the podcast if you haven't already. Share with your friends. And do consider joining as a guest or otherwise as we tackle interesting and solvable problems into the future. Thank you for listening again. Goodbye.